Hello, and welcome back to Calm Case Files. Tonight, we're going to a coastline, a particular stretch of water in the Pacific Northwest of North America, a place where the sea is cold and dark, where forests come right down to the shore, where the light in the mornings is silver and diffuse, filtered through clouds that have traveled all the way in from the open ocean. It is one of the most beautiful places on Earth. And for the past 2 decades, something very strange has been happening there. Something that has puzzled investigators, fascinated scientists, and stayed in the minds of everyone who has heard about it. Shoes have been washing up on the beach. Just shoes. Sneakers mostly. Running shoes. The kind you might wear on a hike, or a walk along the water, or just around the neighborhood on an ordinary Tuesday. And inside them, feet. Human feet. Detached, preserved, alone. Before we can understand the mystery, we have to understand the place. The Salish Sea. The waters of the Salish Sea have been home and highway to the indigenous peoples of the Pacific Northwest for thousands of years. The Coast Salish people, for whom the sea is named, have fished, traveled, and lived along these shores since time immemorial. Geographically, the Salish Sea is not a single body of water, but a network of them. A complex, interlocking system of channels, straits, inlets, and sounds that lies between what is now the Canadian province of British Columbia and the American state of Washington. It includes the Strait of Georgia, the Strait of Juan de Fuca, and Puget Sound, which reaches down toward the cities of Seattle and Tacoma. If you looked at it on a map, you might think of it as an inland sea, enclosed, protected from the full fury of the Pacific Ocean, but still vast, still deep, still cold. Very cold. The waters of the Salish Sea typically hover around 45 to 55 degrees Fahrenheit, roughly 7 to 12 degrees Celsius, even in summer. This is important. We'll come back to this. Cold water does something very specific to the things that enter it and sink. The shoreline is stunning. Islands rise from the water, some large enough to hold small towns, farms, ancient forests. Others just rocky outcroppings topped with a few wind-bent trees. The coastline is irregular and fractured, full of hidden coves and beaches that are hard to reach and easy to miss if you don't know where to look. Most of the people who live around the Salish Sea, and there are millions of them now, in cities like Vancouver and Victoria and Seattle, go their whole lives without ever quite reckoning with how wild the water still is, how old it is, how indifferent. But the sea knows things, and every so often, it returns what it has been keeping. It began on a Sunday, August the 20th, 2007, a warm, late summer day on Jedediah Island, a small, mostly uninhabited island in the southern Strait of Georgia, about 90 miles northwest of Vancouver. A 12-year-old girl was walking along the beach. This is the detail that has always stayed with people, that it was a child who found it. That the story begins not with a detective or a diver or a forensic team, but with a girl doing what children do on beaches, wandering, looking at things, picking things up. She found a shoe, a men's running shoe, size 12, blue and white. Nike, according to reports. The kind of shoe that was ordinary and unremarkable in almost every respect, except that it was heavier than it should have been. She looked inside, and there, preserved inside the sneaker, was a human foot. The girl went and found the adults who were with her. The adults called the authorities. And so began one of the strangest ongoing mysteries in the recent history of either Canada or the United States. 6 days later, a second shoe washed ashore. This one on Gabriola Island, about 30 miles from Jedediah. Another sneaker, another foot. This one from a different person entirely. 2 feet in less than a week. The Royal Canadian Mounted Police were notified. Investigators began asking questions. And almost immediately, people started reaching for explanations. A serial killer. That was the first theory that circulated, and the one that spread fastest. Someone was killing people, severing their feet, and disposing of them in the water. It was lurid and terrible and, as we'll see, entirely wrong. But the fear made a certain kind of sense. What else could explain this? After those first 2 discoveries, people began watching the shoreline more carefully, and the shoes kept coming. In 2008, 3 more feet washed ashore, on Valdez Island, on the Fraser River, near the city of New Westminster. In 2009, 2 more. The pattern continued year after year, irregular and unpredictable, but persistent. A foot here, a foot there. Sneakers and running shoes, and the occasional hiking boot, washing up on beaches from Vancouver Island down to the shores of Tacoma, Washington. By 2011, 11 feet had been found. By 2018, there were 20. 15 in British Columbia, 5 in Washington State. As of the most recent tallies, the count stands at over 20 detached human feet discovered along the coasts of the Salish Sea since that Sunday in August 2007. The cases generated enormous media attention. International headlines, documentary interest, a dedicated Wikipedia page. The story had a quality that was hard to look away from. Each new discovery raised the same questions. Where did this come from? Who did this belong to? And why, of all the strange things the ocean might give back, why only feet? There were hoaxes too, which tells you something about how much cultural space the story occupied. After one particularly high-profile discovery, pranksters began leaving shoes stuffed with chicken bones and animal paws along beaches in British Columbia. Police responded with both frustration and a kind of weary patience. They had to investigate each one. Some of these false alarms were easy to identify. Others required more careful forensic work before being ruled out. And through all of it, the real feet kept arriving. When something this strange happens, people want explanations. That is a profoundly human instinct, the need to make sense of things, to find the story underneath the event. So theories multiplied. The serial killer hypothesis persisted for years, despite the absence of any supporting evidence. Some people pointed to the fact that several of the feet were right feet. Surely, they said, that was meaningful. Surely someone was taking the left feet and leaving the right ones, or the other way around, as some kind of signature. But investigators pointed out that with enough bodies in enough water over enough time, statistical clustering of left or right feet was entirely expected. It meant nothing. There were theories about plane crashes, that some unreported or forgotten aviation disaster had deposited victims into the sea, and that only their feet had survived. There were theories about boats, about containers of migrants lost at sea, about organized crime. Laura Yazejian, a forensic anthropologist and human identification specialist with the British Columbia Coroner's Service, described the tips that came in over the years with a certain dry affection. "We get some very interesting tips," she said. "Serial killers, containers full of migrants sitting at the bottom of the ocean. Aliens had that one as well." The truth, as is so often the case, is smaller and stranger and sadder than any of the dramatic theories. It took years to fully piece together, and it required the work of scientists from several different fields: oceanographers, forensic anthropologists, entomologists, marine biologists. But eventually, patiently, the picture came clear. To understand what was happening, you first have to understand what happens to a human body in cold water. When a person dies in the Salish Sea, whether from drowning, from a fall, from any cause, the body typically sinks. Cold water is dense, and the human body, without air in the lungs, is usually denser than the water around it. So it descends. It settles on the bottom, or near it, in the cold dark. And there it rests. The cold water does something unusual here. It slows decomposition significantly. It also, under the right conditions, can trigger a process called saponification, the conversion of body fat into a waxy, soap-like substance called adipocere. This can preserve soft tissue for a very long time, months, sometimes years. Forensic scientist Gail Anderson of Simon Fraser University, one of the key researchers who helped explain the Salish Sea phenomenon, found evidence of adipocere on many of the feet she examined. This told her that the bodies had sunk and stayed submerged, decomposing slowly in the cold water, rather than bloating and floating as bodies sometimes do in warmer seas. That is where the rest of the bodies are. They are down there, still, preserved in the dark cold, resting on the seafloor of the Salish Sea. The feet are not separated from anything horrific. They are the outliers, the parts that got away. Here is why. Marine scavengers, crabs, fish, various invertebrates, feed on what they can reach most easily: soft tissue, the areas around joints. The ankle, it turns out, is one of the weakest structural points in the human body. The ligaments and tendons that hold the foot to the leg are relatively delicate, and as scavengers work, and as decomposition progresses, the foot can detach quite naturally. But a bare foot, once detached, would sink or drift without ever reaching shore. What makes the Salish Sea feet unique, the thing that makes this a story at all, is the shoes. Modern sneakers and running shoes are packed with foam, air pockets, lightweight synthetic materials designed specifically to cushion and to last. They are, in a word, buoyant. And because the foam in a modern running shoe is extremely difficult for marine scavengers to eat or break down, the shoe stays intact even as the body around it doesn't. So the foot detaches. The shoe, still laced on, floats upward. And then it drifts. Forensic anthropologist Kathy Taylor put it plainly. Feet easily disarticulate, and when they are attached to a flotation device such as a running shoe, they are easily washed ashore. Notice there are no feet washing ashore in stiletto heels or flip-flops. Also, today's running shoes are much more buoyant than in the past. This is why the phenomenon is recent. Not because something changed about the people, or the water, or the world in 2007, but because the shoe industry changed. Sneakers became lighter, more foam-filled, more buoyant. The same innovation that makes them comfortable on a long walk makes them, in the deep cold water of the Salish Sea, a kind of accidental raft. Most of them have been identified now. Through the painstaking work of forensic DNA analysts at the British Columbia Coroner's Service and their counterparts in Washington State, almost all of the feet have been linked to missing persons. Real people with names and families and histories. Many of them had drowned. Some had fallen from boats. Some had jumped from bridges. In the United States, one matched pair of feet, 2 shoes from the same person, was identified as belonging to a woman who had jumped from a bridge. Another foot belonged to a missing fisherman, lost at sea in the way that fishermen have been lost for as long as there have been boats on water. A third belonged to a man who had been struggling with severe depression and who had likely walked into the sea of his own choosing. His family asked that his name not be released, and their wish was honored. In British Columbia, the stories are similar. Most of the identified feet came from people who had gone missing after struggling with mental illness or addiction, or the particular kind of despair that sometimes brings people to the water's edge. One case was Antonio Neal. Antonio was 22 years old when he disappeared on December the 12th, 2016. He had grown up in Everett, Washington, and by his mother's description, Jenny Dobozinski, he was her best friend. "We talked about everything," she said. Antonio had struggled with addiction. In 2016, he celebrated 1 year of sobriety. But that October, he relapsed. He lost his place in the sober house where he'd been living. A friend offered him his couch for the night of December 12th. His mother spoke to him that day, and then nothing. Years passed. The case remained open. And then a boot washed ashore. DNA analysis linked it to Antonio Neal. His case was moved from missing persons to active investigation. His mother finally had something. Not an answer, not a resolution, but something. An end to the anguish of not knowing. "I miss his laugh," Jenny said. "His comfort, his voice. I miss everything about Antonio." The Snohomish County Sheriff's Office has kept Antonio's case open. It is the one Salish Sea case that investigators have described as suspicious, not definitively explained by accident or suicide, still carrying questions that haven't been answered. His family is still waiting. When we talk about cases like this, it's easy to lose sight of the fact that each data point was a person. Each shoe on a beach had a foot inside it, and each foot was attached to a life, and each life had people who loved it and looked for it and waited by the phone. The Salish Sea is surrounded by millions of people, and like all places where many people live near deep, cold water, it receives the losses that come with that. People who fall from boats, from kayaks, from rocks along the shore. People who go for a walk and don't come back. People who are struggling so much that the water begins to seem like an answer. What the Salish Sea feet have given us, in addition to their strangeness, their scientific intrigue, their viral mystique, is a kind of quiet accounting. A reminder that these people existed, that they were here, that something of them endured. By 2021, every person whose foot had washed ashore in the Salish Sea had been identified. through DNA analysis, through cross-referencing with missing persons databases, through the dedicated and quiet work of people who spend their careers doing this kind of piecing together. Every foot had a name attached to it. None of them were victims of a serial killer. None came from a plane crash or a container of migrants or anything otherworldly. They were people who died in the water, by accident, by choice, by the 1,000 ordinary ways that human beings are lost to the sea. The mystery, in the end, was not sinister. It was sad. And it was, in its own way, a story about how the world works, about physics and biology and geography and the slow passage of time, about how things that are lost do not always stay lost, about how cold water keeps its secrets for a long time, but not forever. I find something almost comforting in that. Not because loss is comfortable, or because grief is easy, or because any of this erases the tragedy of lives cut short, but because there is something in the idea of the sea giving back, even in fragments, even in this particular strange way, that speaks to a kind of persistence, a refusal on the part of the physical world to simply erase people. They were here. They wore these shoes. They walked through these mornings and these evenings and these ordinary days, and then they were gone. But they were not nothing. They were not erased. The sea kept something of them, and eventually, in its cold and patient way, it returned it. If you enjoyed this video, please like, subscribe, and share your thoughts. See you in the next one.